December 16th, 1944. Early morning, Mona, Germany. The frozen ground trembled as another volley of American artillery screamed overhead. But this morning, something was different. Terrifyingly, almost inconceivably different. The shells were not striking earth or trees. They were detonating in midair, precisely above the advancing German positions, producing a lethal rain of steel fragments no foxhole could withstand. Among the 326th Volksgrenadier Division assaulting the 38th Cavalry Squadron's lines, soldiers hardened by years on the Eastern Front confronted a phenomenon that upended their understanding of combat. These were not the familiar artillery patterns, the predictable impacts, the presumed safe zones, the protective value of entrenchments. This was death delivered from above with mathematical precision. At that moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had just made one of the most consequential unauthorized choices of the Battle of the Bulge, defying standing orders and without permission from higher command. He instructed his gunners to load shells fitted with the Allies' most closely guarded secret, proximity fuses. These devices, containing tiny radar systems that sensed distance to a target and detonated at the optimum height, would increase artillery lethality by a factor of 50. The arithmetic of death was about to be rewritten in the frozen Ardennes. What the German soldiers could not know was that they had encountered a weapon so revolutionary. It would alter not only this battle but the very character of warfare itself. The storm unleashed by Operation Wach dem Rhein had begun with tremendous promise for the Wehrmacht. Hitler's last gamble marshaled some 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all masked by the foggy cover of the Ardennes. The Führer had assured his generals the offensive would split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and reverse a war that was slipping inexorably toward defeat. The initial bombardment at 05:30 on December 16th achieved complete tactical surprise. German guns fired at a rate of 1,600 rounds per minute along the 85-mile front. American intelligence had failed catastrophically. It had not detected the massive buildup, and many frontline units were either inexperienced replacements or exhausted veterans transferred to this quiet sector for rest. But at Mona, Colonel Axelson faced an impossible tactical dilemma. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance detachment, was being overwhelmed by superior German forces. Conventional artillery could not halt the assault. In desperation, Axelson made his historic call: deploy the secret proximity-fused shells without authorization. He would later face possible court-martial for the decision, but in that instant he recognized that strict obedience would mean certain defeat. The result was immediate and devastating. German troops advancing in traditional assault formations suddenly found themselves subject to a type of fire they had never seen. The shells exploded 30 to 50 feet above them, each burst creating a cone of fragments that covered far more area than conventional ground-burst shells. Veterans who knew how to shelter from normal artillery were cut down in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, anywhere they had hoped to be safe. The proximity fuse represented the convergence of American scientific ingenuity and industrial capacity at their zenith. Unlike conventional rounds that required direct impact or time fuses that often detonated at incorrect heights, the proximity fuse housed a self-contained radar no larger than a coffee can. Inside each fuse, American engineers packed some 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on model, that could survive the incredible 20,000 times gravity force of being fired from a cannon. The physics were staggering. Upon firing, the acceleration would crush a glass ampule containing electrolyte, creating a battery that powered the tiny radar for the shell's flight. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had driven this effort with Manhattan project-level intensity. The laboratory, disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, employed a significant fraction of America's physicists at peak production. Security rivaled that of the atomic program. Workers could not discuss their work even with family, and each fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking. The technical challenge had seemed insurmountable. Vacuum tubes built for home radios had to be completely redesigned to survive being fired from guns. They had to function while spinning at extreme RPMs, operate in all weather, and be sensitive enough to detect targets without premature detonation. The breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later transform the electronics industry. Dr. James Vann. Allen's tubes were no larger than pencil erasers, yet contained the elements of conventional radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Over 100 companies contributed to the effort, from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crossley Corporation. The program's cost reached $1 billion in 1940s dollars, second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime spending, authorization crisis, and expansion. Axelson's unauthorized use on December 16th created an immediate command crisis. He had violated direct orders, restricting proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use, fearing that captured examples might be reverse-engineered by the Germans. But the devastating effectiveness at Mona was undeniable. The German attack had been stopped cold with casualties that shocked both sides. Word of the weapon's impact reached Supreme Headquarters rapidly. General Eisenhower, recognizing the desperate situation developing across the Ardennes, formally requested authorization on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions were lifted, and proximity fuses were released for general ground combat use across the entire Bulge battlefield. The rapid distribution that followed demonstrated American logistical superiority. Within days, proximity-fused shells were being delivered to artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received their allocation just as the German ring closed around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, began using them to defend the northwest approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. Each unit discovered the same truth. Proximity fuses transformed artillery from a support weapon into a decisive battlefield tool. Forward observers no longer needed to carefully adjust fire. The fuses would find their own optimal detonation point. Accuracy requirements decreased while lethality increased exponentially. Bastogne, surrounded but superior. The siege of Bastogne provided the perfect demonstration of proximity fuses in defensive warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and outnumbered, held the vital crossroads against repeated German assaults. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75 mm pack howitzers capable of firing proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds according to official unit records. While not all were proximity-fused due to limited supply, those that were had devastating psychological and physical effects. German assault formations simply melted away under the airburst barges, with entire platoon eliminated in seconds. The December 22nd attack, following General McAuliffe's famous nuts, reply to the German surrender demand, showcased the weapon's effectiveness. German infantry, advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations, were caught in the open. The proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that left no safe zones. The All-African EMEA 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally crucial role. Their 155 mm howitzers created a ring of death around Baston's perimeter that German forces found impenetrable. The larger shells, detonating at 50 ft, covered even greater areas with lethal fragments. German prisoners later reported that attacking units often lost cohesion before even reaching American lines, with soldiers fleeing the incomprehensible airbursts. The Sauer River slaughter, perhaps the most thoroughly documented demonstration of proximity fuse lethality, occurred at the Sauer River near Ardennes on December 25th to 26th. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed this engagement and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen river believed they were hidden by darkness and fog from American observers. Traditional artillery would have required careful adjustment of fire, giving the Germans time to complete their crossing or seek cover, but proximity-fused shells needed no such adjustment. Patton wrote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new posit ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. The river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies." This figure, 702 killed by actual count, represents one of the few precisely documented casualty figures from proximity fuse employment. The mathematical efficiency was stark. A single battalion essentially ceased to exist in minutes with no possibility of escape or defense. The psychological impact spread throughout German units in the sector, with soldiers refusing orders to conduct river crossings. Forest warfare transformed. The Ardennes' dense forests, which Germans counted on for concealment, became death traps when proximity fuses entered the equation. In open terrain, a proximity fuse detonating at 30 to 50 FD was deadly enough, but in forests, the effects multiplied exponentially. The air bursts shattered tree branches, creating thousands of additional wooden projectiles. These splinters, some as long as a man's arm, traveled at hundreds of feet per second with lethal effect. Traditional defensive positions, taking cover behind large trees, digging foxholes under root systems, became useless. The fragments and splinters came from above, negating centuries of tactical wisdom about forest fighting. American artillery units quickly recognized this multiplier effect. A single proximity-fused 155 mm shell detonating above the forest canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. The combination of metal fragments from the shells and wooden splinters from the trees produced a deadly 360-degree kill zone that no amount of tactical expertise could escape. German troops trained in forest combat found their experience useless. Spreading out to minimize casualties made formations susceptible to the wide area effects, while clustering together for mutual defense meant that entire squads could be annihilated by a single shell. There was no effective tactical countermeasure to this new menace. It was technological. Dominance in motion, the proximity fuse functioned on principles that seemed straight out of science fiction to 1940s soldiers. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter operating between 180 and 220 MHz, continuously emitting waves that bounced off surrounding terrain, trees, vehicles, and even human bodies. As the projectile neared its target, the reflected signal intensified until it reached a preset threshold corresponding to the optimal burst altitude, at which point an electronic trigger initiated detonation. The entire mechanism had to perform flawlessly under conditions that would destroy ordinary electronics. Upon firing, acceleration reached 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to crush a human body to microscopic thickness. The shells spun at incredible rates, generating immense centrifugal pressure, and endured temperatures ranging from the 3,000 degrees of heat of the gun barrel to freezing cold at the peak of their flight paths. Yet the fragile vacuum tubes, protected by innovative shock-absorbing systems, survived and functioned with over 80%. Reliability optimal detonation heights were determined through rigorous testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground for 105. Howitzers, around 30 feet, proved ideal. The larger 155mm guns achieved maximum lethality at 50 feet, while the rare 240mm shells produced devastating results at over 70 feet, capable of clearing entire grid zones of enemy troops. This technological edge translated directly into battlefield supremacy. Studies revealed that proximity fuses multiplied lethality 5 to 10-fold compared to standard shells, with the effective kill radius increasing 50 times. In anti-aircraft use, the improvement was even more dramatic. Success rates in intercepting V-1 flying. Bombs jumped from 17% to 79% within weeks of deployment. Intelligence collapse and German. Misjudgment, German intelligences. Failure to grasp the significance of the proximity. Fuse proved disastrous. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot, capturing roughly 20,000 proximity-fused shells, a potential gold mine of information. Yet when German specialists analyzed the fuses, they dismissed them as technically impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes in artillery shells defied their understanding of electronics and physics. Some experts speculated that the Americans were employing magnetic sensors, while others believed the visible components were decoys concealing a secret mechanism. This misunderstanding stemmed partly from institutional arrogance. Germany had actually pioneered early proximity fuse designs before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes as early as 1940. However, Hitler's decree canceling any weapons project requiring more than 6 months to reach production had terminated development. German scientists simply couldn't comprehend that the Americans had solved the very problems they had once abandoned. The irony deepened when considering German technical capabilities. Their electrostatic proximity fuses showed 95% reliability in tests using electrical capacitance changes rather than radar. Had development continued, Germany might have fielded proximity fuses by 1941. Hermann Göring would later admit during interrogation that German fuses were 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. The Christmas catastrophe. December 25, 1944, brought no holiday respite. German units attempting to use Christmas for resupply and reorganization discovered that proximity fuses recognized no ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most proximity fused. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared. The ability to fire effectively without observation in poor weather during darkness transformed artillery from a daylight weapon into a 24-hour threat. The psychological impact was severe. German soldiers had learned to move during poor weather when Allied aircraft couldn't fly and observers couldn't spot them. Proximity fuses eliminated this sanctuary. Death could arrive at any moment in any weather with no warning beyond the brief whistle of incoming shells. Malmy and Skorzeny's elite. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's elite commandos attempted to capture Malmedy. These weren't ordinary soldiers but specially selected troops who had rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms. They represented the best Germany could field. They met devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that transformed their American disguises from tactical advantage to death shrouds. The shells exploded overhead with uncanny precision, as if they could detect the imposters below. While exact casualty figures remain disputed, the attack failed catastrophically with heavy losses that ended Scorsese's offensive operations. The psychological breakdown among elite SS troops proved particularly significant. These soldiers, indoctrinated with beliefs in German superiority and trained to the highest standards, found themselves helpless against American technology. Some survivors reportedly charged directly toward American lines, preferring quick death to continued bombardment, a complete breakdown of military discipline among Hitler's most fanatical troops. Industrial achievement. The production miracle behind proximity fuses matched any wartime industrial achievement. By December 1944, over 100 American companies had converted to fuse production. The Crossley Corporation abandoned refrigerator manufacturing for fuse assembly. Emerson Radio retold from home electronics to weapons production. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire facilities to the program. Quality control exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the 130 components underwent individual testing. Every solder joint was inspected under magnification. Random samples were actually fired to ensure survival under combat conditions. The rejection rate was ruthless. Any component showing slight deviation was discarded. The workforce, predominantly women, maintained this precision while working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. They couldn't know what they were making due to security compartmentalization. They only knew it was vital to the wherefore. By December 1944, they were producing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock. The cost reduction achieved was remarkable. In 1942, each fuse cost $732, more than a worker's annual salary. More than a worker's annual salary. By December 1944, mass production had driven costs to $18 per unit, while maintaining quality. This efficiency allowed the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 deployed during the Battle of the Bulge alone. Patton's arithmetic. General Patton understood proximity fuses' value better than perhaps any commander. His Third Army, driving Torliev-Bastogne, used them as a breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed new tactics specifically for proximity fuse employment. Williams pioneered the time-on-target concentration using proximity fuses, multiple battalions firing simultaneously so shells arrived together. When dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at optimal height, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death. In the week between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The results were decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself wrote, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Elsenborn Ridge holds the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated proximity fuses at maximum effectiveness. Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held critical terrain against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Lippstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, with approximately 40,000 being proximity fused. These 25% of shells accounted for an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties. The mathematics were undeniable. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by a factor of 4. The German attacks, launched repeatedly up the steep forested slopes, met walls of air-burst steel. Entire companies disappeared in seconds. Bodies piled so thick that subsequent waves had to climb over their own dead. After 3 days, the attacks ceased. The light of the Waffen-SS had been broken by American technology. Operation Bodenplatter's destruction. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatter, 900 fighters attacking Allied airfields. The surprise was complete, catching many Allied aircraft on the ground. But returning German pilots met walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, most using proximity fuses. The kill rate stunned both sides. German pilots trained to evade predictive anti-aircraft fire-found shells detonating precisely where they would cause maximum damage. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, never recovered from these losses. Breaking the secret. By early January 1945, maintaining secrecy became impossible. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers had witnessed their effects. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited disclosure. The New York Times reported on a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns without explaining the technology. German intelligence finally grasped the weapon's significance too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Armies West stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist. Strategic Impact Assessment." Post-war analysis revealed proximity fuses' decisive impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso Mantoyel, 5th Panzer Army commander, testified, The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops. The statistics tell the story. 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, up to 20% of total German losses. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition, while requiring no forward observation in poor weather. The human cost. Behind every statistic lay human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the war's final stages, died in ways that traditional warfare had never contemplated. They were killed by weapons that seemed to possess intelligence that could find them wherever they hid. American production workers paid their own price. Factory accidents were hushed up for security. Workers at Crosley Corporation, Emerson Radio, and other facilities suffered breakdowns from stress and exhaustion. They produced weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they were making, carrying that burden in enforced silence. Yet the moral calculation of war is never simple. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer would the war have lasted? How many more Holocaust victims would have perished while battles raged? Every day, the war shortened, potentially saved thousands in concentration camps awaiting liberation. Technological legacy. The proximity fuse program generated advances that transformed post-war technology. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became foundations for modern electronics. Quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry standards. The organizational methods coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation, later discovering Earth's radiation belts. Theodore principles evolved into modern systems. The concept of autonomous sensors making decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition today descends from the proximity fuse, the first weapon that could sense its environment and choose when to detonate. The revolution begun in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields where smart weapons dominate. Warfare. Final reckoning. The Battle of the Bulge ended. January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. Hitler's last offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties while achieving nothing. American losses totaled 75,000, including 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a war winner. General Eisenhower's later reflection, that if the Germans had possessed proximity fuses, D-Day might have been far more difficult, perhaps even impossible, underscored just how strategically vital this invention truly was. These devices were not merely an artillery enhancement, but a revolutionary leap that rewrote the very mathematics of warfare. German soldiers who endured proximity-fused bombardments faced something they could scarcely comprehend: death delivered by shells that seemed intelligent, that hunted them wherever they hid, turning the air itself into a weapon. Their ordeal marked the dawn of a new era in combat, the age of technological warfare. From Colonel Oscar Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, to the mass deployment of over 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses proved that scientific ingenuity could yield decisive victories. The fusion of American industrial might, scientific brilliance, and adaptive battlefield leadership produced a weapon that helped tip the balance of the entire war. Ultimately, the story of the proximity fuse is one of transformation, technological, tactical, and profoundly human. It proved that an industrial democracy could forge instruments of staggering precision and lethality, that innovation could offset numerical inferiority, and that scientific superiority often decides the fate of nations. In the frozen woods of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare was truly born. The equations of death were recalculated by tiny radar brains encased in steel shells, and warfare from that moment onward would never be the same. Those German soldiers who perished beneath the shimmering rain of proximity-fused explosions fell not only to an artillery barrage, but to the first revolution of a new military era, one whose echoes still shape the modern battlefield today.